Hey Carl, I have a knock knock joke for you. Knock knock. Come on, you gotta say the stuff, right? Just go along with me, okay?
Who's there?
Nobody.
Nobody who?
It's April 2020, Carl. Seriously, nobody's there.
You're all alone.
Hi, and welcome to another video lecture with me and my faithful friends Carl and Ivan, though Ivan's really been slacking off lately, so who knows. Today, we're going to talk about worshiping God. The primary question for today is, should we worship God? And if so, how should we worship God? To explore these questions, we're going to examine the notion of worship itself. After we examine the notion of worship, we're going to ask, is worship appropriate for God, especially in the face of the existence of evil? Next, we're going to unpack a tradition that is very foreign to many worshipers today, and that is the tradition of lament and protest in the midst of worship. It's my hope that exploring these different themes will help you think about God and the idea of worship. Let's get started. In common usage, worship tends to refer to acts of reverence and or adoration toward a god or gods. Oftentimes, these acts are in the context of religious ceremony. For example, Mass. The notion then behind worship is that the worshiper, in this case the human being, turns toward God and offers this notion of adoration, of reverence, of respect, lifting God up as it were and acknowledging who God is, what God is like, and who we are in relationship to God. Now that's a very basic definition and understanding of worship. However, one thing I will point out is this understanding of worship tends, especially in Christian circles, to be understood almost exclusively as thinking of God in a positive light. In other words, the notion of worship always means positive adoration of God. With this kind of definition, there's very little room for anything like critique of God, questioning God, doubting God, let alone accusing God. However, it's important to note that the notion of reverence does not negate the possibility of protest, lament, accusation. I'm sure we all know people that we respect, whom we also question at times, whom we also doubt at times, and even whom we also might call out or make accusations against at times. In fact, I might go so far as to say we are more likely to critique people when we respect them, because we respect them enough to be honest with them about how we feel. All that being said, it is a common notion that worship is almost entirely made up of positive regard for God. And that raises the question, how can we have such positive regard for God when there is such extensive evil in the world, both moral and natural? In other words, in a world where children are constantly dying of disease and where things like genocide occur, how can we possibly look to God with positive adoration? Now, if you're paying attention to past videos, you'll recognize that I'm asking a question that's in line with the experiential or existential problem of evil. This version of the problem of evil isn't so much interested in whether or not God exists, but more in how does the existence of evil affect our relationship with God in terms of trust, or love, or in this video, worship. Let me paint the picture as poignantly as I can just to bring this point home. In previous videos, I've noted that when discussing God, it's always important to note which God we are talking about. After all, there are many different versions of God out there, and we want to be clear about which one we're discussing. But let me make one point clear. If you are worshiping God, there are only two basic categories of God you can be worshiping. And that is the God who either could not or did not rescue the Jewish children of Nazi Germany from torture. There are simply no other gods available. Why do I say this? Well, quite simply because well over 1 million Jewish children were tortured in Nazi Germany, or at least in Nazi-occupied areas. Over 1 million children tortured. Because we know that they actually were tortured, if there is a God, that God either did not stop that torture or could not stop that torture. If there is a God, one of those two has to be true. So again, that's the only God that we can worship, the God who did not or could not rescue those children. And this, of course, raises the question, can we worship this God? Can we truly have adoration and respect for the God who either did not or could not save them? Consider, if God did not save them, that is, if God chose not to save them, we might not want to worship this God because we might question this God's character. After all, if you could save a child from torture, wouldn't you do it? And if I told you that I could have saved a child from torture, but decided not to do so, especially for some reason as paltry as I wanted to respect the torturer's free will, you would probably lose a lot of respect for me and not think of me as a very good person. And yet, God has not saved millions of children, and we still worship God. So perhaps it might be easier to say that God could not save those children. And granted, at first, it might seem that this God is much easier to worship. After all, how can we hold God accountable for what God could not do? But there are two problems with this way of thinking. One, if we maintain, as Christian theology tends to maintain, that God created the world, either by just snapping God's fingers to bring it about, or by slowly luring it over time into its current shape, we have to note that God created a world in which the torture and death of children seems all but inevitable, but God cannot stop that torture from occurring. Why would God bring this world into existence knowing that this kind of thing would happen and knowing that God wouldn't be able to stop it? In other words, why would God bring a world into existence in which there would inevitably be victims that God could not save? The second problem is, if God can't save these children from torture, how can we have any reasonable hope that God can save anybody? In that sense, it's unclear that there's any great benefit to saying that God did not save them or that God could not save them. In both cases, there are good reasons to question God's character and question the amount of trust or hope or faith that we put in that God. At first glance, then, it might seem obvious that we should not worship God. How could we bring ourselves to praise or adore or reverence a God who did not or could not save those children? But it's at this point that I think it's important to recover the tradition of lament and protest. In this tradition, the people who are worshiping or addressing God do not always view God in a favorable light. In fact, sometimes they are downright accusatory toward God. They argue with God, debate with God. They challenge the way God is handling things. They express doubts toward God. For many of us, this seems very strange. How could anybody do this? And if you've grown up in a strong religious background, it may be that you were told it's not your place to question or doubt God. But let me point out that this notion of lament and protest is very much part of the biblical tradition, both in Judaism and in Christianity. And it's not the people who lack faith who question or doubt God. In fact, it's the people who have the most faith, the people who are considered to be righteous. For example, Abraham questioned God over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. Moses argued with God, and by the way, won the argument over the fate of Israel. Prophets like Amos would call God to change God's mind about decisions that God had made, and oftentimes they were successful in getting God to change God's mind. In the book of Psalms, which is sometimes considered Israel's prayer or worship book, there are passages that directly accuse God of violating the covenant that God had made with Israel. In other words, it's saying to God, you made a promise to this people, and you are not keeping your promise. You are in the wrong here. Making this particular accusation against God is serious business. You are definitely calling into question God's very nature as one who is faithful, loving, kind, compassionate, but also as one who is just. But it's not just in the Hebrew Scriptures or Old Testament that we find people questioning or accusing God. It also happens in the New Testament. And the most interesting example by far is the example of Jesus himself. The reason this example is so interesting is because in Christian theology, Jesus tends to be understood as God incarnate. God is understood as Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, three persons who exist as one God. And one of those persons, the Son, became incarnate, that is, became flesh, and dwelled in the world among other human beings. And in Christian theology, this is Jesus. But it's important to note that Jesus was a first-century Jew. Sometimes Christians forget this, especially when they're engaging in anti-Semitic rhetoric. Jesus was a Jew, so to be anti-Semitic is to be anti-Jesus. Sorry, that's the way it is. But as a Jew, Jesus seemed to be very aware of this tradition of lament and protest. And one of the statements he says while he is hanging on the cross, according to the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark, is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now here he's drawing on the 22nd Psalm, in which the author there levels the same accusation against God. But it's important to note that Jesus repeats the accusation that God has forsaken him, and that God's decision to do this is questioned. Now think about this. The fact that Jesus, understood as God the Son incarnate, Accused God, perhaps here understood as God the Father, at least raises the question that accusing God is actually a godly thing to do. Paradoxically, when we lament against God, when we protest God, when we accuse God, we are in the company of none other than God. Now, admittedly, that's a bit of a strange thing, and sometimes it makes your head just want to go. That was a really scary graphic, Carl. Don't do that again. At any rate, this tradition of lament and accusation has persisted in the Jewish tradition, even though it really hasn't been that strong in the Christian tradition. For example, Elie Wiesel, a survivor of the Holocaust, recounts that in Auschwitz, a number of Jewish scholars actually put God on trial. They brought evidence against God that God had violated the covenant with the Jewish people. The really interesting thing is, at the end of the trial, they actually find God, in a sense, guilty. That is, they find that God has violated the terms of the covenant and that God owes them something. In the midst of the horrors of the Holocaust, they do not offer a positive regard for God. It may be reverence, but it's not adoration. They are accusing God, finding God guilty. But what's really strange about the story is what happens next. Wiesel tells us that after these scholars found God guilty, they all gathered together and prayed. And I really like the way one writer says it. A guilty God is still God. What's interesting about this discussion is it kind of shifts the question. The original question, should we worship God, is a legitimate question, and people disagree on this matter. People have good reasons not to worship God, not to adore God. And of course, other people have good reasons to worship and to adore God. But what I want to note here is that the question almost suggests a false dichotomy, that worshiping God either means complete positive regard for God, or no relationship with God at all. There is, of course, a third option, and that is an option in which lament and protest and accusation are part of our religious lives. In this sense, even if we answer, yes, we should worship God, we still have to ask what might be a more important question. How should we worship God? Should it really be blind adoration? Should it really be absolute, unwavering, unquestioning trust? Well, interestingly enough, the biblical narrative suggests maybe not. Perhaps it's acceptable to question God, to doubt God, even, as Jesus did, to accuse God. Perhaps Jesus' question, my God, why have you forsaken me?" should not be understood as a faithless claim, but a faithful claim. After all, Jesus is still addressing God, still speaking to God, and Jesus respects God enough to deliver this accusation against God, to be honest with God. Now, to be clear, nothing I've said in this video about lament and protest or accusation exonerates God. We're still talking about the God who either did not or could not rescue those children. But perhaps a better way to approach such a God includes doubt, questioning, protest, lament, and even accusation. Of course, as always, I have no interest in telling you what you ought to do when you worship God or if you should worship God. But it's my hope that this video will give you a better sense of why you worship God, if you do, and how you ought to worship God, if you do. Let's take a step back and summarize. First, we defined worship as acts of adoration and reverence toward God. We noted that this understanding of worship often entails a focus on praising or adoring God. That is, it often has a positive regard for God. We then question whether or not it is reasonable to have this positive regard for God, given the amount of evil that's in the world. Finally, we consider the tradition of lament, protest, and accusation as a way in between absolute positive regard for God and a complete lack of worship of God. So what do you think? Is God worthy of worship? And if so, should we lament? Should we accuse? Should we protest? Or should we simply engage in positive adoration? Until next time, goodbye.